The scent of jasmine and jet fuel hung heavy over the Santa Cruz Mountains as I steered my dust-covered electric sedan past the wrought-iron gates of Atherton. In the world's most expensive zip code, my car was an eyesore, a practical blemish on a landscape of pristine, hand-manicured hedges and 5-acre estates. To my left and right, the valet stand was a graveyard of 7-figure machinery. Pagani Huayras custom-wrapped Lamborghinis and armored SUVs that cost more than a suburban home. I adjusted the rear-view mirror, checking the simple black sheath dress I'd bought on sale at Nordstrom. My reflection showed Evelyn Reed, 34-years-old hair pulled back into a severe professional bun, and eyes that had seen enough of humanity's darkness to last 3 lifetimes. I was a federal judge for the Northern District of California. I spent my days presiding over antitrust lawsuits against tech giants and dismantling international money laundering rings. I held the power to freeze the assets of billionaires with a single stroke of my pen. But as I stepped out of the car, I wasn't Judge Reed. I was just Evelyn, the family failure. The Reed estate, a sprawling neoclassical monstrosity, pulsed with the rhythmic thrum of a live jazz quartet. My parents, Julian and Eleanor, had rented the property for the weekend to host my younger sister Skylar's engagement party. It was a $250,000 charade. I knew for a fact that my father's energy company was $40 million in the red and facing a hostile takeover. Yet here they were, serving vintage Krug and beluga caviar on silver platters. I smoothed my skirt and approached the massive mahogany front doors. I was carrying a peace offering, a rare vintage bottle of Napa Valley Cabernet from a private reserve worth about $500. It was a gesture to celebrate Skylar marrying into the Sterling family, the undisputed royalty of Silicon Valley software. The door swung open before I could knock. My mother Eleanor stood there in a gown of shimmering silk that likely cost more than my annual mortgage payments. She didn't smile. She didn't offer a hug. Her eyes immediately raked over me with the clinical coldness of a border guard inspecting a suspicious package. "You actually wore that," Eleanor hissed, her voice a sharp whisper designed to stay beneath the music. Evelyn, I specifically noted black tie on the digital invitation. "You look like you're headed to a deposition or a shift at a funeral home." "Hello to you too, Mum," I said, my voice practiced and even. "I brought this for Skylar and Terence. Congratulations." I handed her the bottle. Eleanor glanced at the label, snorted, and practically shoved it back into my sternum. "Put this in the pantry before someone sees it. We're serving the Sterlings tonight, Evelyn. Do you honestly think I'm going to put a government worker special on the same table as their private seller imports? Hide it. Now." I stepped into the grand foyer, the air thick with the smell of expensive perfume and desperate ambition. My father Julian was across the room, laughing too loudly at a joke made by a group of venture capitalists. He caught my eye for a fleeting second, his expression flickering with a mix of annoyance and shame, before he looked away, pretending I was just another member of the catering staff. I looked around for Skylar, hoping to offer a quick congratulations and disappear into a quiet corner until I could make a polite exit. But before I could move, Eleanor's hand clamped onto my forearm. Her manicured nails, sharpened to lethal points, dug into my skin. "Where are you going?" she demanded, pulling me toward a side hallway. "I just got here, Mum. I want to see Skylar." "You aren't going out there to mingle." Eleanor snapped, her eyes darting around to ensure no one was watching. She dragged me through a set of heavy swinging doors and into the sterile fluorescent heat of the industrial kitchen. "The catering agency sent 2 servers home with the flu. We are severely understaffed and the Sterlings expect perfection. I will not have your drab public service energy dragging down your sister's chance at a $10 billion merger. Charles." She reached onto a stainless steel prep table and snatched up a heavy, grease-stained catering apron. She crumpled it into a ball and threw it at my chest. "Put this on," she commanded. "You're going to clear the appetizer trays and run the industrial dishwasher. Keep your head down. Do not speak to the guests. And for the love of God, do not tell anyone you are related to us. If Silas Sterling finds out my eldest daughter is a low-level clerk, pushing papers for a pathetic government salary, he'll think our family is destitute. Make yourself useful, Evelyn. Since you brought nothing of value to this family, you can at least provide the labor. I stood frozen. Around me, a dozen professional chefs and servers blurred past, carrying trays of oysters and Wagyu beef. I looked down at the stained apron in my hands. The audacity was almost breathtaking. In my world, I was a woman of absolute authority. I commanded a courtroom where even the most arrogant CEOs stood when I entered. I made rulings that shifted the tectonic plates of the global economy. Yet here, in the distorted reality of my mother's ego, I was nothing more than a secret to be hidden, a tool to be used, and a failure to be shamed. I could have dropped the apron. I could have walked out, climbed into my car, and never looked back. But years of conditioning, the deep-seated childhood need to avoid one of Eleanor's catastrophic public meltdowns, kept me rooted to the tile floor. I told myself it was just for one night. I would play the role of the invisible, obedient daughter one last time, and then I would cut the cord forever. I tied the apron over my dress and stepped up to the massive sink. The water was scalding, the steam rising around my face as I began to scrub the remnants of truffles off fine bone china. The muffled sounds of the jazz quartet drifted through the walls, a cruel soundtrack to my humiliation. I had been scrubbing for nearly an hour when the kitchen doors swung open with a violent thud. I didn't turn around, assuming it was another waiter with a fresh load of filth. But the heavy, cloying scent of designer perfume told me exactly who it was. Skylar sauntered in, looking radiant in a custom gown that Eleanor had bragged cost $50,000. She was dripping in diamonds, her every movement a calculated display of stolen wealth. She stopped behind me, the rustle of her silk skirts loud against the hum of the refrigerators. "Well, look at you." Skylar laughed, a sharp metallic sound. "Mum said she'd found a way to make you fit in." "Honestly, Evelyn, the apron suits you. It's the first time you've looked like you belong in a house this expensive." I turned off the faucet and faced her, wiping my wet hands on the apron. "Congratulations on the engagement, Skylar. You look expensive." She ignored the jab. She was holding a stack of dirty, half-eaten appetizer plates. With a smirk, she leaned forward and carelessly dropped the entire stack into the sink directly in front of me. The heavy porcelain crashed into the water, splashing greasy dishwater and cocktail sauce all over my face and my black dress. "Oops," Skylar said, her voice devoid of any real apology. "Watch yourself, Caroline. That's vintage crystal. If you break a single glass, your pathetic little government paycheck for the next 5 years wouldn't be enough to replace it. Try not to ruin my perfect night with your miserable, poor person energy." I watched her through the small, circular window of the kitchen door as she strutted back into the foyer. I wiped the sauce from my cheek, my heart thumping with a cold, methodical fury. The heavy oak front doors opened and the atmosphere in the room shifted. Silas Sterling stepped inside a man whose influence stretched across the entire Pacific Rim. He was followed by his son, Terence. My parents practically tripped over themselves to greet them, Richard pumping Silas's hand with a desperation that was painful to watch. I stood in the shadows of the kitchen, a maid, in a stained apron, watching my family lie to the world. But as my mother guided the billionaires toward the champagne tower, she glanced back at the kitchen window. Our eyes locked for a split second. Her smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated loathing. She pivoted on her heels, marched to the kitchen door, and I heard the heavy metallic click of the electronic deadbolt. My own mother had just locked me inside the kitchen. "Stay there," her muffled voice hissed through the wood. "Don't you dare show your face. You are a secret, Evelyn, and secrets stay hidden." I leaned against the sink, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. I didn't cry. I didn't scream. I just reached into the hidden pocket of my dress and pulled out my phone. It was vibrating. Not a text. Not a call. It was a Tier 1 emergency alert from the Federal Credit Monitoring System. I looked at the screen. The words were bright, pulsing red. Alert, your commercial loan of $5 million is severely past due. Immediate federal asset seizure pending. The air in the kitchen turned to ice. I had never taken out a loan in my life, but I knew exactly who had. The industrial kitchen of the Atherton estate was a masterpiece of cold stainless steel and architectural indifference. Under the buzzing fluorescent lights, the air felt thick, charged with the ozone of a looming storm. I stood paralyzed, my fingers trembling slightly as they gripped my encrypted federal smartphone. The notification wasn't just a digital banner. It was a death warrant for the life I had meticulously built. $5 million, default status critical, ISA. As a federal judge, my survival depended on my impartiality and my cleanliness. I was the person who sat on the bench and looked down at the desperate, the greedy, and the corrupt. My financial records were audited with the scrutiny of a microscope. A $5 million shadow debt standing in my name was more than a scandal. It was an anchor that would drag me into the depths of a federal penitentiary. I leaned against the prep table, the cold metal biting into my palms. My mind, trained for years to pass complex conspiracy cases, began to run the discovery phase. How had they done it? Julian. My father had always been a man of shortcuts. I remembered 3 weeks ago when he had asked me to digitalize some old family records using my high-security government scanner. He had praised my success, called me the pride of the family, for the first time in a decade. It had been a Trojan horse. He hadn't wanted the records. He had wanted my digital signature, my federal credentials, and the metadata that proved the documents were signed by a high-ranking government official. He hadn't just stolen my money. He had stolen my authority. Outside, the heavy bass of the jazz quartet vibrated through the floorboards. I could hear the clinking of crystal and the manic, high-pitched laughter of my mother Eleanor. She was out there playing the role of the Silicon Valley matriarch, wearing a silk gown paid for by the destruction of her eldest daughter's soul. I looked at the mountain of dirty dishes in the sink. The irony was a physical weight. I was being treated like a servant in a house built on the ruins of my own credit score. I walked to the kitchen door and pushed. It didn't budge. I pushed harder, my shoulder aching against the heavy wood. Nothing. Then I heard it, the distinct digital chirp of the smart lock system engaging. My mother had locked me in. "Mom!" I called out, my voice low but sharp. I tapped on the small circular glass pane of the door. Eleanor opened the door. Now! I saw her silhouette pause on the other side of the glass. She didn't turn around. She just adjusted her pearl necklace in the reflection of a nearby mirror and leaned toward a guest, her voice drifting through the cracks. "Oh, don't mind the noise. Just a clumsy new hire in the kitchen. It's so hard to find good help these days." The betrayal was complete. They didn't just want my money. They wanted me erased. I was a ghost in their machine, a private bank account with no face. A cold, tectonic shift occurred in my chest. The daughter who sought approval. The girl who had spent her life trying to prove she was enough, despite not being a billionaire, finally let go. I didn't feel sadness. I felt a terrifying, crystalline clarity. I scanned the kitchen. I wasn't looking for an exit. I was looking for a weapon. My eyes landed on a heavy, professional-grade meat tenderizer, a solid block of patterned steel. I didn't hesitate. I swung the mallet with the full force of my fury into the plastic housing of the electronic lock. The first strike cracked the casing. The second sent a shower of sparks, flying as the lithium battery shorted out. On the third strike, the magnetic seal groaned and died. The door hissed open. I stepped out of the kitchen, shedding the grease-stained apron like a snake shedding its skin. My black dress was dampened with dishwater, and my hair was slightly disheveled. But as I adjusted my cuffs, I didn't look like a maid. I looked like a storm. The foyer of the Reed estate was a cathedral of vanity. Massive crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting fractured light over 300 of Northern California's elite. Tech founders in T-shirts that cost more than my car venture capitalists, with predatory smiles and socialites dripping in ethical diamonds. At the center of the room stood Julian. He was holding a glass of vintage scotch. His arm draped around the shoulder of Silas Sterling, the titan of Sterling software. Julian was mid-sentence, his voice booming with the false bravado of a man who knew he was winning. "So I told the board," Julian laughed. "If you want the Reed Energy patents, you have to play by my rules. We're looking at a tenfold return by Q3. Silas Sterling nodded politely, though his eyes, sharp, observant, and legendary, for spotting a lie, seemed bored. I marched through the crowd. People instinctively stepped back, not because they recognized me, but because of the sheer vibrating energy I was emitting. I was a glitch in their perfect, expensive reality. "Julian," I said. I didn't yell. I didn't have to. I used my bench voice, the one that made even the most aggressive trial lawyers sit down and shut up. The circle of billionaires went silent. Julian turned his smile frozen like a mask of cracked porcelain. When he saw me standing there, stained, disheveled, but standing tall, his eyes filled with a primal, animalistic fear. "Evelyn," he stammered, stepping forward to block me from Silas Sterling's view. "Sweetheart, you're supposed to be helping. Did something break?" "Everything is broken, Julian," I said, stepping around him so I was face to face with both men. I held up my phone, the $5 million default notice glowing like a flare. "We need to discuss the bridge loan you secured from the Cayman Private Equity Group, the one where you forged my federal ID and my judicial signature." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence that followed. Even the jazz band in the corner trailed off into a confused, discordant note. Eleanor appeared out of the shadows, her face a mask of frantic, manic politeness. She grabbed my arm, her nails digging into my skin. "Evelyn, dear, you're exhausted. The stress of your little office job has clearly gone to your head. Let's go to the study and get you some water." "Get your hands off me, Eleanor," I said, shaking her off with a violence that shocked her. Skylar, my sister, pushed her way to the front, her $50,000 silk train trailing behind her like a dead weight. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated loathing. "What is wrong with you? This is my night. Terrence and I are about to announce the merger. Do you have any idea what you're doing to our reputation?" "I'm not doing anything to your reputation, Skylar," I replied, my voice echoing off the marble walls. "I'm just reading the charges. You want to talk about a merger? Let's talk about the merger of your wedding budget and my life savings. Let's talk about the $5 million our father stole using my name." Julian lunged for the phone, but I stepped back, my eyes flashing. "Don't. You've spent 30 years treating me like a backup plan, Julian. You treated me like a safety net you could shred whenever you felt like falling. But you forgot one thing." I stepped closer to Silas Sterling. The tech mogul was leaning back, his arms crossed, watching the scene with a terrifyingly neutral expression. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice steady, "I believe the last time we spoke you were standing before my bench in the San Francisco Federal Building. Sterling Software versus the Department of Justice." Silas's eyes widened. He took a step forward, squinting at me through the dim amber light of the foyer. He looked at my stained dress, then at the fierce, unmistakable authority in my gaze. "Judge Reed," he whispered. The name rippled through the room like a shockwave. "Judge," The guests began to whisper. The daughter is a judge. My God, Silas said, a genuine rare smile of respect touching his lips. I didn't recognize you without the robes. You ruled against my company's acquisition of Cloudcore. You gave me the most articulate, devastating dressing down of my career. He turned to Julian, his smile vanishing instantly, replaced by a cold, predatory steel. Julian, you told me your daughter was a junior administrative assistant. You told me she was unstable and handled your private filings. Julian was shaking. Sweat was pouring down his face, ruining his silk tie. Silas, she's... It's a family misunderstanding. Evelyn is just prone to exaggeration. I am a federal judge, Julian. I interrupted, my voice dropping an octave. And you just confessed to wire fraud and identity theft in front of 300 witnesses and a man you're trying to swindle. I turned back to Silas Sterling. Mr. Sterling, if you move forward with this merger, you are moving forward with a family that is currently being flagged by the SEC and the FBI. I am filing the criminal complaint tonight. I'd suggest you check your due diligence. My father didn't just steal from me, he's been using my name to bypass the regulatory checks on your investment. Silas looked at Julian, then at Skylar, who was now sobbing into her hands. Finally, he looked at Terence, his son, who stood frozen and ashamed. The deal is off, Silas said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the finality of an execution. And Julian, if I find out a single cent of sterling money was touched by this fraud, I won't wait for the FBI. I'll ruin what's left of you myself. Silas turned to me and gave a sharp, respectful nod. My apologies, Judge Reed. It seems I was almost a party to a very ugly crime. As the Sterling family marched toward the exit, the rest of the guests followed like rats, fleeing a sinking ship. Within 10 minutes, the grand ballroom was empty, save for the family of ghosts standing in the wreckage of their own lies. Julian slumped against a marble pillar, the Scotch glass shattering on the floor. Eleanor was staring at her reflection in a mirror, her world ending in the silence. Skylar looked at me, her face contorted with hate. I hope you're happy. You destroyed everything. I have nothing now. I looked at my sister, then at the parents who had tried to bury me alive. I felt no pity. I felt no regret. You have exactly what you paid for Skylar, I said, turning toward the front door. And as for the 5 million, I'll see you all in court. I hear the presiding judge is very, very strict. I walked out into the cool Atherton night, the gates of the estate closing behind me for the last time. For the first time in 34 years, the air tasted like freedom. The silence that followed the departure of the Sterling family was more deafening than the jazz music had ever been. The grand foyer, once a stage for the most expensive performance in Northern California, was now a hollowed-out shell of broken glass and shattered egos. But the nightmare was only beginning for me. As I turned to leave, my father's hand, stronger and more desperate than I had ever known, clamped onto my shoulder. Julian Reed didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a cornered animal. You aren't going anywhere, Evelyn, he hissed, his breath smelling of expensive scotch and rot. Before I could react, the heavy mahogany doors were slammed shut by 2 men I hadn't noticed before. They weren't standard event security. They were fixers' men in tactical suits with earpieces and cold, hollow eyes. My father had hired a private security firm to ensure the night went smoothly. Now they were my jailers. Take her back to the office, Julian commanded. Julian, I was marched through the house past the silk drapes and the original Picassos, into my father's private study, a room shielded with copper mesh to prevent electronic eavesdropping, a Faraday cage. My mother Eleanor followed us in her face no longer manic, but eerily calm. She sat behind Julian's desk and began scrolling through a tablet. We checked your phone's outgoing pings before the signal cut out, Evelyn, Eleanor said, not looking up. You managed to send a burst of data to your clerk. Very clever. But in this house, we control the gateway. Nothing left the local server. Your evidence is sitting in our cloud waiting to be deleted. I stood in the center of the room, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. You're holding a federal judge against her will. That's kidnapping. That's a life sentence in a maximum security facility. Do you even realize the line you've crossed? Julian laughed, a dry, rattling sound. The line was crossed the moment we realized you were going to let this family rot just to keep your hands clean. That $5 million loan. It's already been moved through 3 shell companies. If you don't cooperate, the paper trail will show that you orchestrated the fraud to fund a private offshore account. We didn't just steal your name, Evelyn. We built a cage out of it. He leaned over the desk, his eyes bulging. You're going to sign the correction of records document. You're going to swear that the loan was authorized by you for a private investment. You do that, and we all walk away. You refuse, and I'll make sure the FBI finds enough evidence in your apartment to make you the face of judicial corruption for the next decade. I looked at the man who had raised me, and for the first time I didn't see a father. I saw a sociopath. They had turned my own career, my obsession with the law, into the very weapon they were using to execute me. I was left alone in the study for the cooling off period. The fixers stood outside the door, their shadows stretching across the polished oak floor. I sat in the oversized leather chair, staring at the darkened computer monitors. My mind was a courtroom. I began to run the prosecution against my own family. I needed a way out, but more than that, I needed to recover the data they had intercepted. My father was tech literate, but he was old school. He believed in walls and locks. He didn't understand the back doors that I had learned to navigate while presiding over the Sterling Software antitrust case. I looked at the digital clock on the desk. 11:42 p.m. In 18 minutes, the automated federal audit would trigger, and the $5 million default would become public record. I had 18 minutes to turn the tide. I reached into my hair, pulling out a small, unassuming bobby pin. I didn't use it to pick a lock. I used it to press the microscopic hard reset button on the base of the VoIP desk phone, a system integrated into the house's main server. The phone rebooted. Because the house was a smart home, the phone system shared a bridge with the security server. If I could trigger a diagnostic mode, I could bypass the Faraday cage's signal dampener just long enough to send a distress signal. But then the door opened. It wasn't Julian. It was Skylar. She was still in her wedding dress, but the lace was torn at the hem. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and deep-seated resentment. She held a glass of water, her hand shaking. "They're serious, Evelyn," she whispered, setting the water down. "Dad's already talking to a lawyer about how to structure your confession. He says if you go down, the rest of us can start over in Europe. And you're okay with that, Skylar? You're okay with your sister spending 20 years in a cell so you can have a flat in London?" Skylar looked away, her eyes filling with tears. "You were always the smart one, the one who didn't need anyone. I have nothing else. Without the sterling name, I'm just a girl with a failed brand and a mountain of debt. You have a career. You have power." "I have nothing if I don't have my integrity," I said, leaning forward. "Skylar, look at me. When the FBI comes, and they will come, they won't care about Dad's structure. They'll see a family that conspired to ruin a federal official. They'll take you too, unless you help me." "How?" she breathed. "I need your phone, your personal one. It's not registered to the house's secure hub. If I can tether it to the desk phone's diagnostic port, I can bypass Mum's firewall." Skylar hesitated. For a moment, the ghost of the little girl I used to protect from our parents' screaming matches flickered in her eyes. But then the door creaked. Eleanor stood there, her eyes narrow and predatory. "Skylar, out! Now!" Skylar scrambled out of the room without looking back. My one chance at a tether walked out with her. Eleanor walked toward me, a silver tray in her hand. On it was a single sheet of paper, the confession. "Time's up, Evelyn," she said, her voice dripping with a terrifying motherly sweetness. "Julian is losing his patience. And when your father loses his patience, he stops being a businessman and starts being a monster. Sign it, and we can all go to sleep." I looked at the paper. It was perfectly drafted. It admitted to unintentional misappropriation of funds due to personal gambling debts. A lie designed to destroy my character so thoroughly that no one would ever believe my side of the story. "I won't sign it," I said, my voice steady. Eleanor sighed, a sound of genuine disappointment. "I always knew you'd be the difficult one. Julian—" My father entered the room, his face dark. He wasn't carrying a pen this time. He was carrying my federal ID, which he had snatched from my purse. He held a lighter underneath it. "This is your life, Evelyn," he said, as the plastic began to bubble and blacken. "Watch it burn." He grabbed my arm, forcing me toward the desk. Eleanor held the pen out like a dagger. "Sign it," Julian roared. I looked at the charred ID, then at my father. I felt the physical pressure of their shadows closing in on me. The panopticon was complete. They had the walls, they had the data, and they had the physical power. But they didn't have the one thing that mattered, that Betsy. I grabbed the pen. My parents leaned in their faces, lit with a grotesque triumph. I touched the nib to the paper, but I didn't write my name. I wrote 4 words in a bold, jagged hand: Sub poena duces tecum. "What is this?" Julian barked. "It's a legal command, Julian," I said, looking up at him with a smile that made him flinch. "It means, bring the documents under penalty. And you've been recorded saying everything I need for a grand jury for the last 20 minutes. "Recorded how?" Eleanor shrieked, looking around the room. I pointed to the VoIP phone. The diagnostic light was blinking green. I didn't need Skylar's phone. I just needed to trigger the emergency 911 override. In a house this expensive, an E911 call automatically opens a 2-way audio bridge to the local precinct and records all ambient sound for the first responders. Every word of your structure, every threat, and every confession of fraud is currently being transcribed at the San Mateo County Sheriff's Department. Shit. The color drained from Julian's face until he looked like a corpse. The sound of a distant siren began to wail, cutting through the quiet Atherton night. You bitch," Julian whispered, raising his hand. "Go ahead," I said, standing up to meet him. "Add assault on a federal official to the recording. I'd love to have the extra evidence." The sirens grew louder, blue and red lights beginning to flash against the heavy drapes of the study. The fixers outside the door began to flee. My parents stood frozen in the wreckage of their empire, trapped in a Faraday cage of their own making. I walked past them, my black dress torn, my face bruised, but my head held high. I pushed open the mahogany doors and stepped out into the night. The law wasn't a cage, it was a shield. And tonight it had held. The sirens didn't just scream. They harmonized with the crushing finality of a gavel. As I stepped out onto the vast cobblestone motor court of the Atherton estate, the world was no longer bathed in the warm amber glow of billionaire vanity. It was strobing in violent bursts of police cruiser blue and emergency response red. The fixers, those slate-grey shadows Julian had hired to be my jailers, were the first to break. They were professionals, which meant they knew exactly when a paycheck was no longer worth a federal obstruction charge. I watched as they dropped their tactical gear and raised their hands, their expensive earpieces clattering to the pavement like plastic bones. Judge Evelyn Reed, a tall woman in a tactical windbreaker with FBI emblazoned in high-visibility yellow across the back, stepped into the light. It was Special Agent Sarah Miller. I had signed her warrants for 3 years. We had dismantled a human trafficking ring in Oakland together. She didn't look at my torn dress or the bruise blooming along my jawline with pity. She looked at me with the professional recognition of a fellow soldier. "I'm here, Sarah," I said, my voice cracking only slightly. "The recording should be live on your server. Every word from the last 25 minutes. "We got it, Judge," Miller said, signaling her team to breach the front doors. "Clear and loud. We have the kidnapping, the extortion, and enough wire fraud to bury Julian Reed under the prison." Behind me, the house, that neoclassical monument to my family's ego, seemed to groan. I turned to see Julian and Eleanor being led out in the walk of shame. Julian wasn't yelling anymore. The bravado had leaked out of him, leaving a shriveled, greying man who couldn't even meet my eyes. Eleanor, however, was still fighting. Her hair was a mess, her silk gown caught on the doorframe, and she was shrieking about rights and social standing to a young officer who looked like he'd heard it all before. "You're a monster, Evelyn!" Eleanor screamed as they pressed her head down to fit her into the back of a cruiser. "We gave you everything we made you. You're nothing without the Reed name." "The Reed name is a liability now, Mother," I whispered, though she couldn't hear me over the sirens. "I'm keeping the title. You can keep the name." Then came Skylar. She walked out voluntarily, her $50,000 wedding dress, dragging through the oil and dirt of the driveway. She looked at the flashing lights, the handcuffs, and the grim faces of the federal agents. She looked at me standing there with Agent Miller, and for a second I saw a flash of the sisterly bond we once had. But it was replaced by a hollow, haunting realization the fairy tale was dead, and she was the one who had poisoned the well. "What happens to me?" Skylar asked, her voice small, almost childlike. "That depends on how much you tell the grand jury about that $5 million loan, Skylar," I said, "and how much you knew about the wellness facility in Zurich." She collapsed into a heap of silk on the pavement, sobbing not for our parents, but for the loss of the sterling diamonds and the life of leisure she had stolen from my future. I watched as the tow trucks arrived to impound the fleet of luxury cars. I watched as the evidence teams began to carry out crates of proprietary servers from the sanctum. This wasn't just a family dispute anymore. It was the demolition of a dynasty. 6 months later, the United States District Court for the Northern District of California was a familiar place to me. But today I wasn't sitting on the bench. I was sitting in the witness box. The courtroom was packed. The Atherton fraud case had become a national obsession, a story of a federal judge held hostage by her own billionaire family. The media called it the gilded betrayal. Julian and Eleanor sat at the defense table. They looked different now. Julian's tan had faded into a sickly prison pallor, and Eleanor's designer clothes had been replaced by a conservative charcoal grey suit meant to make her look like a distraught mother instead of a co-conspirator. Their lead attorney was a shark named Marcus Thorne, a man who had made a career out of making the guilty look like victims. "Judge Reed," Thorne said, pacing the floor with theatrical grace, "you claim your parents stole your identity. But isn't it true that you had a falling out with your family over your sister's marriage? Isn't it true that this entire whistleblowing event was actually a calculated act of revenge because you felt overlooked?" I sat up straight, my hands folded on the railing. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at the jury. 12 ordinary people from San Francisco and Oakland who had to decide if the law actually applied to the people in the mansions. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice projecting with the authority I had honed over 1,000 trials. I didn't need revenge. I had the law. I didn't feel overlooked. I was physically locked in a kitchen and then a Faraday cage while my parents discussed how to disappear me into a foreign psychiatric ward to cover their $5 million theft. But the documents, Thorne shouted, slamming a folder onto the table. We have the digital signatures. They were verified from your personal laptop. Are you telling this court that your parents, two elderly people, are elite hackers? They aren't hackers, Mr. Thorne, I replied calmly. They are predators. They waited for me to visit. They used a high-resolution scanner to capture my retinal biometrics while I was sleeping, and they used my own government-issued security key, which my father took from my bag while I was forced to wash his dishes. The courtroom gasped. The dishwashing judge had become the rallying cry for the prosecution. And Skylar? Thorne asked, his voice softening into a fake empathy. Your own sister. She has testified that you were emotionally unstable that night. Skylar testified to save her own skin, I said, looking directly at my sister, who was sitting in the back row, her face hidden behind oversized sunglasses. But her phone records tell a different story. The GPS pings from her device show she was standing outside the study door for 20 minutes while I was being threatened. She didn't call the police. She didn't call for help. She waited to see who would win. The prosecution then played the recording the E911 audio bridge I had triggered from the VoIP phone. The sound of Julian's voice filled the room, cold and jagged. I built a cage out of your name, Evelyn. You refuse, and I'll make sure the FBI finds enough evidence to make you the face of judicial corruption. Then came Eleanor's voice. Be a good girl, Evelyn. Skylar needs this. Don't be so selfish. The silence in the courtroom after the recording ended was absolute. The distraught mother act was over. Eleanor buried her face in her hands, and Julian stared at the table, the reality of the 20-year mandatory minimum finally setting in. As I stepped down from the witness box, I walked past the defense table. Julian reached out his hand, trembling as if to grab my sleeve. Evelyn, he whispered, his voice cracking. We're your family, we're your blood. I stopped and looked at him. I didn't see the man who had terrified me in the study. I saw a small, broken criminal who had traded his daughter's life for a temporary stay of execution on his bank account. Blood is just a biological fact, Julian, I said loud enough for the court reporter to hear. The law is a choice. You chose to break it. I chose to uphold it. I walked out of the courtroom, my heels clicking on the marble floors. Outside, the San Francisco fog was rolling in cool and clean. Silas Sterling was waiting by the steps, surrounded by his own security detail. He stepped forward, removing his hat. Judge Reed, he said, I've followed the trial. I wanted to apologize again. If I had known what they were. It's over, Mr. Sterling, sir, I said. The debt has been reassigned to their liquidated assets. My credit is being restored by a court order, and my family is exactly where they belong. What will you do now? He asked. I imagine the bench feels a bit small after all this. I looked out over the city, toward the federal building where I had spent my life serving a system that I had finally had to use to save myself. The bench is exactly where I belong, Silas, I said, a small, genuine smile finally breaking through. But tomorrow I think I'll take the day off. I have a lot of dishes to throw away. I walked toward my car, a new, modest electric vehicle paid for with my own salary, and drove away. The name Reed would forever be associated with a scandal, but the name Judge Evelyn Reed would be remembered for something else entirely. The woman who proved that no matter how much money you have, you can never buy your way out of the truth. The gavel hadn't just fallen. It had shattered the very foundation of the Reed name. Following the trial of the century, the federal government moved with the clinical efficiency of a harvesting machine. Under the racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization's RICO Act, the entirety of Julian and Eleanor's estate was flagged for civil forfeiture. I stood on the sidewalk of a fog-drenched morning in San Francisco, clutching a cup of black coffee that tasted like iron and long nights. Across the street, the headlines on the digital kiosks were relentless "Reed Empire, auctioned to repay $5 million fraud." It wasn't just the 5 million. Once the Department of Justice began pulling at the loose threads, I had provided the entire tapestry of Julian's business career unraveled. There were offshore accounts in the Cook Islands shell companies in Delaware, and a decade's worth of tax evasion that made the original identity theft look like a misdemeanor. I watched from a distance as federal marshals began the process of clearing out the Atherton estate. The sanctum, where I had been held captive, was now being stripped of its mahogany paneling and its Renaissance art. The Faraday cage was being dismantled, its copper mesh sold for scrap. There was a poetic justice in watching the fortress of their secrets being turned into a line item on a government spreadsheet. A black town car pulled up to the curb, and a familiar figure stepped out. Silas Sterling didn't look like the billionaire predator I had faced in the courtroom. He looked like a man who had narrowly escaped a plane crash and was still checking himself for injuries. "Judge Reed," Silas said, leaning against the car door. "I heard the news. The sentencing phase is over. 15 years for Julian, 12 for Eleanor. Minimum security for the mother, but your father is headed to Lompoc." "It's what the guidelines dictated, Silas," I said, my voice devoid of the triumph I thought I would feel. "The law doesn't care about bloodlines or Atherton zip codes. It only cares about the math of the crime." "And Skylar?" Silas asked, his voice softening. "My son Terence, he's been a wreck. He really thought he was marrying into a dynasty. He didn't see the rot." "Skylar took a plea deal," I replied, looking toward the bay. 3 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. She has to work in a legal aid clinic, ironically. She'll be filing paperwork for the kind of people she used to look down on from her father's balcony. It's the most honest work she's ever done. Silas studied me for a long moment. "The Sterling board wants to make a gesture, Evelyn. They were impressed, terrified actually, by how you handled the situation. We want to establish a scholarship in your name for women entering federal law. A Reed Fellowship for Judicial Integrity." I turned to him, the first hint of a real smile touching my lips. "I'd appreciate that, Silas. But don't call it the Reed Fellowship. Call it the Evelyn Fellowship. I'm in the process of legally reverting to my grandmother's maiden name. I want to be Evelyn Thorne. I'm leaving the Reed name in the evidence locker where it belongs." Silas nodded, a gesture of profound respect. "Thorne, gesture of, I like it. It has an edge, suits you." As he drove away, I realized that the liquidation wasn't just about the houses and the cars. It was about the psychological debt I had carried since childhood. For the first time in 34 years, my ledger was clear. I didn't owe my parents my silence, my career, or my identity. I was finally legally and spiritually a free woman. Freedom, I quickly learned, has a strange rhythm. 2 months after the sentencing, the silence of my life was almost unsettling. I had moved into a new apartment, a minimalist loft in Soma with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over the city. No more government worker special sedans. I had treated myself to a top-tier electric SUV, a symbol of my own independence, paid for with the back pay I'd received after being cleared of all fraudulent charges. I was back on the bench, presiding over a complex maritime dispute, when my clerk Marcus handed me a sealed envelope marked "Confidential Eyes Only." Inside was a single handwritten letter on yellow legal pad paper. It was from Julian, sent from the Federal Correctional Facility. Evelyn. The letter began, the handwriting shaky and lacking its former executive flourish. "You think you've won. You think the system you worship has saved you. But you forgot one thing. I didn't just steal your name to get the money. I used your name because I knew you'd find out. I wanted you to see that even a federal judge is just a number in a database. I wanted to break your faith in the law. Did it work? Or do you still believe in the fairy tale? I sat in my chambers, the weight of the letter feeling heavier than the $5 million default. It was his final act of psychological terrorism, an attempt to poison my victory from behind bars. I spent the next 3 hours in the courthouse basement in the deep storage archives, where the digital footprints of the Reed case were kept. I wasn't looking for more money, I was looking for the why. Julian was right about one thing: the system was cold. It didn't care about the fairy tale. It only cared about the data. But as I scrolled through the archived records of the loan applications, I found something my father had missed. Something his arrogance had blinded him to. In the security credentials section of the $5 million loan, there was a secondary authentication log. Julian had used my retinal scan and my signature, but the system had required a third, trusted contact for a loan of that magnitude. Julian had listed Eleanor, but Eleanor hadn't signed it. I traced the IP address of the third signature. It hadn't come from the Atherton estate. It had come from a public Wi-Fi network at a Starbucks in Palo Alto. At that exact time, Eleanor was hosting a charity brunch in San Francisco. The third signature belonged to Skylar. My innocent sister hadn't just been a witness. She had been the silent partner who pushed the button. She had been the one who finalized the theft, knowing it would bury me because she wanted the Sterling marriage at any cost. She had let our parents take the fall for the mastermind portion of the crime, while she played the victim to get probation. I sat in the dim light of the archive room, the humming of the servers, the only sound in the world. I had the power to reopen the case. I could call the US attorney present this new metadata, and Skylar would be in a jumpsuit by Monday morning. I looked at the Submit Evidence button on my screen. My finger hovered over the key. Then I thought about the recording in the study. I thought about Skylar's face as she walked through the oil and dirt of the driveway. I realized that Julian's letter was a trap. He wanted me to become like him, a person who used the law as a scalpel to excise family members, a person who lived for the gotcha moment. If I prosecuted Skylar now, I would be proving him right. I would be letting the Reed rot dictate my future actions. I closed the file. I didn't delete it. I was a judge after all, and I wouldn't destroy evidence, but I encrypted it with a 256-bit key that only I possessed. I walked out of the courthouse and into the brisk San Francisco evening. I didn't go to my car. I walked to a small, unassuming park overlooking the Golden Gate Bridge. I took Julian's letter out of my pocket, tore it into 100 tiny pieces, and let the Pacific wind carry them away into the dark water. Julian wanted to break my faith in the law. He wanted me to believe that justice was just a game of who could manipulate the system better. He was wrong. Justice wasn't about the fairy tale of a perfect family. It was about the choice to be better than the people who tried to break you. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in months. Legal Aid Clinic, North Bay, a voice answered. It was tired, strained, and sounded remarkably like Skylar's. Skylar, I said. There was a long, sharp intake of breath on the other end. Evelyn. Is that you? I'm calling to tell you that I'm moving forward with the Thorne name, I said, my voice calm and final. And I'm calling to tell you that I'm donating the remaining liquidated assets from the estate, the money the government didn't seize, to your clinic. It's about $200,000. Use it to help people who actually deserve a second chance. Evie. I don't know what to say. Why? Because the case is closed, Skylar, I said. And because I'm the one who decides when it's over. I hung up. I looked at the bridge, its orange lights glowing through the mist like a path to the future. The $5 million was gone. The family was broken. But the Tam Fan was still standing. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't just holding the gavel. I was holding the peace. This is the final chapter of the saga. In part 10, we see the ultimate transformation of Evelyn Thorne, no longer a victim of her family's shadow, but a beacon of the justice she once served from the sidelines. The air in the San Francisco Federal Building always smelled of old parchment floor wax and the heavy, invisible weight of consequence. But today, the atmosphere felt different. As I walked through the vaulted marble rotunda, the click of my heels didn't sound like a woman fleeing a scandal. It sounded like a woman claiming her territory. On my desk sat a small engraved nameplate. It didn't say Evelyn Reed. It didn't say Tam Fan. It simply read Evelyn Thorne. I ran my thumb over the crisp edges of the silver lettering. The transition had been quiet, but the internal shift was seismic. I had spent 34 years as a Reed, a name that meant to be used, to be hidden, and to be blamed. Now I was a Thorne, a name with edges, a name that belonged to the woman who had survived the most expensive betrayal in Silicon Valley history. My clerk Marcus knocked softly on the heavy oak door. He looked at the new nameplate and gave a small, respectful nod. The docket is clear for this afternoon, Judge Thorne, but there's someone in the lobby. He says he doesn't have an appointment, but he thinks you'll want to see this. I smoothed the front of my black silk robe. Who is it, Marcus? Silas Sterling, and he's brought a courier. Sir. I walked out to the lobby, my robes billowing slightly behind me. Silas was standing by the window, looking out at the city he helped build. When he turned to face me, he looked older. His eyes softened by the realization that even the most powerful men can be blinded by the wrong people. Evelyn, he said, stepping forward. I wanted to deliver this personally. The board approved it this morning. It's the final deed to the Atherton property. I froze. The Atherton property, Silas, the government seized that. It was auctioned to pay off the RICO claims and the bank fraud. Silas smiled, a sharp, knowing glint in his eye. It was auctioned, and a shell company called the Thorne Foundation bought it. I'm the chairman of that foundation's trust, Evelyn. We bought it back for the exact amount of the original debt, $5 million. Consider it a return on an investment in the truth. He handed me a leather-bound folder. Inside was the title to the estate, where I had been forced to wash dishes while my future was being sold. What am I supposed to do with a haunted house, Silas? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. That's the thing about property, Evelyn, Silas replied. The walls don't remember the crimes. Only the people do. You can tear it down. You can sell it. Or you can turn it into something that Julian Reed would hate more than anything in the world. I looked at the deed. I thought about the kitchen with the industrial dishwasher. I thought about the sanctum, where my father had tried to erase my soul. I'm not going to live there, I said, a slow, predatory grin spreading across my face. I'm going to turn it into the Thorne Institute for Judicial Ethics and Whistleblower Protection. We're going to train young lawyers how to take down people exactly like my father. The very room where he tried to kidnap me will be a library for civil rights law. Silas laughed, a deep, genuine sound. I think that's the most terrifying thing I've ever heard. Julian will have a stroke when he reads about it in the prison newsletter. Good, I said. Let him see that his legacy wasn't the money. His legacy was the woman he accidentally created. As Silas left, I walked back toward the courtroom. I stopped by the tall windows of the hallway, looking out at the fog rolling over the Golden Gate Bridge. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a notification from the North Bay Legal Aid Clinic. A photograph. It was Skylar. She wasn't wearing Dior or Chanel. She was wearing a simple, nondescript navy blue uniform. She was standing in a cramped, fluorescent-lit office, holding a stack of files for a pro bono immigration case. She wasn't smiling for a camera. She was looking at a document with an expression of intense, focused concentration. She had sent a short text, I'm learning how the paperwork actually works, Evie. It's harder than it looks. Thank you for the second chance. I don't deserve it, but I'm going to try to earn it. I didn't reply. I didn't need to. The silence between us was no longer a weapon. It was a bridge. The bailiff opened the doors to the courtroom. "All rise," he bellowed. I stepped up onto the bench, the high-backed leather chair supporting me. I looked out at the gallery, at the lawyers, the defendants, the families, and the seekers of truth. I didn't see numbers in a database. I didn't see assets or liabilities. I saw human beings in need of the one thing I had fought to preserve. I picked up the gavel. It was heavy, solid, and real. I thought about the night in Atherton, the grease-stained apron, the shattered crystal, the feeling of the electronic lock clicking shut. I realized that my parents hadn't actually locked me in that night. They had inadvertently set me free. They had stripped away the Evelyn who wanted to be loved and left behind the Evelyn who was meant to be feared by those who stood against the light. I looked down at the new nameplate on the bench. Judge Evelyn Thorne. I didn't feel like a victim. I didn't feel like a survivor. I felt like the architect of my own destiny. I brought the gavel down with a single sharp, resounding crack that echoed through the marble hall. "Court is in session," I said, and for the first time in my life, the words felt like home.